Hey everybody, I'm the Artful Spuddler and welcome, or welcome back, to my world of contemporary batik painting. In this video I'm going to begin to explain colour theory and then how I use this theory in my work. And if you are a batik artist already, but always seem to create muddy or olivey colours, then hang around and I should be able to give you some tricks and tips on how to avoid this. So let's get going. The very first thing that you need to remember are those art classes when you were maybe 4 or 5 and when you learned about primary, secondary and tertiary colours. I suspect that you were taught the red, yellow, blue colour wheel. These days there are in fact a number of colour wheels available to choose from. All are correct and most are specific to what or how the colours are being created. The colour wheel is a circle diagram that illustrates the relationship between different colours. Colour wheels are vital in understanding colour relationships, or colour families as I call them, and how to mix and use colours to create the mood and effect that you need. There are a number of variations to that original colour wheel that have been developed to assist artists and technicians to mix colours via a variety of mediums, from printing to digital art, and the colour wheel that I use in my work is the CMYK colour wheel, with turquoise replacing cyan. Now, if you aren't used to this colour wheel and think that you've never seen it before, well, this is the same colour wheel that is used in inkjet printing, and these are the colours that you buy in cartridges to provide ink to the printer. These are the 4 colours that I usually use in my work, and I tend to stick to these in most paintings, so I think it's worth spending a few moments just talking a little about what I've learned about these 4 dyes. So let's start with lemon yellow. This dye mixes well and is a great cold yellow, but it is important that you use this lemon yellow and not a golden yellow. And this is because the warm yellow contains a tiny amount of magenta in it and therefore is not a primary colour. The turquoise is the dyeing alternative to the cyan mentioned in the colour wheel, and again it mixes well. Unlike the magenta, which seems to be far more intense, and it takes quite a time to make sure all the powder has dissolved in the chemical water properly. In order to speed this process up, I sometimes heat up my chemical water in the microwave, just a little, and this slight heat can help to dissolve the powder more quickly. But in the main, I just tend to mix up my magenta before I mix the other dyes, stir and let it settle, stir again, and repeat until I'm absolutely sure all the dye has dissolved properly. And one final thing that I've noticed with magenta is that the particles get everywhere and can travel quite a long way on the air. I know this because not only do they tend to appear on my cloth with no reason for them being there at all, but when I wipe down the surfaces of my studio there is always a pink tint to the cloth where it's picked up the rogue particles that have dropped there that have been travelling on the air. So watch out for this and mix your magenta a long way away from your fabric if you don't want pink dots appearing when you first wet your cloth. There are a number of blacks available to use as your key, but in the main there are 2, jet black 150 and warm black 128. Personally, I tend to use the jet black, which is a cold black, but you can easily use the warm black instead, or even a combination of the 2. Now in watercolour, there's a great debate about whether or not using a black watercolour paint is okay. This is because that black paint contains more opaque and light absorbing properties, which make them appear to block out the colours that were painted onto the paper before. However, with Procion dyes, the blacks are made simply by mixing the primaries together and the translucency of the colours is not affected. So instead of mixing up turquoise, magenta and yellow to create my own black, for the purposes of batik painting, I tend to use a pre-mixed black, but if you don't like this, you can simply mix up your own. So with all that said, let's get back to colour and colour mixing and return to that colour wheel. As the dyes that you apply to your fabric are incredibly translucent, every future dye will always be affected in some way by the colours that were dyed previously to that part of your fabric. And so one of the biggest battles when using fabric dyes is making sure that adding all 3 primaries to the same area is done in an incredibly managed way. Let me explain that a little more. One simple rule to follow when mixing colours is try to avoid adding all 3 primaries together. Now both the lemon yellow and the turquoise are cold colours, with only the magenta being a warm primary. So this naturally divides the colour spectrum into two camps, those with and without magenta. Let me explain this a little better. Adding any two primaries together will always make a strong and clean colour. However, as I've already covered, if you mix all three primaries together in equal amounts, you will create a strong, good black. And the blacks that you buy are made the same way. However, if you mix these three primaries in unequal amounts, then you will create muddy colours. And for some reason with me, they always seem to look olivey. So the first rule of colour mixing when painting on fabric is to avoid the muddy colours, and therefore avoid adding all three primaries together, whether on your palette or, and here comes the difficult bit, on your cloth through successive dye sessions. And what that means is that throughout the development of your painting, if an area has been dyed firstly in magenta and then in yellow, if you then add a dye containing turquoise, your colours will instantly begin to turn muddy. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously many colours that are considered muddy are in fact great colours, such as browns and even some olives. The point is that unless you mean to make these colours, you need to avoid all three colours in one area, and when colour planning, all these technical issues can be addressed before you ever pick up your dyes. So when I begin a painting, I spend quite a bit of time creating a line drawing and then colour planning my image. I will explain more about my planning stage in a future video, but for now just know that colour planning is really important if you want your colour mixing to be a success. I often refer to colour families when planning my work, so let me explain what that means. If you take any two primary colours and then add the colours that are between these on the colour wheel, then that is a colour family. With colour families, you can freely use any of them in an area of your fabric and know that your colours will remain clean, that is, not muddy. An example of a colour family is magenta to yellow and includes orange and red in the family. Another is turquoise to magenta, and this family contains magenta, purple, blue, and obviously turquoise. And finally, turquoise to yellow, which also contains green. Now, the easiest way to explain all this is to set myself up with my dyes, some cotton fabric, and I'll simply show you. But before I get on with the demonstration, let me quickly run through how I draw up my work and prepare my cloth for painting. When dyeing cloth, unlike the thick watercolour paper, the dyes will soak through your fabric fully, and because you need to control the spread of these dyes, working on a flat surface doesn't really work. Your fabric needs to remain slightly above the flat surface, allowing any excess dye to drip through the weave and collect on the worktop or table below. So when batik painting, you need to use a frame. I will do a video about all the options available, but if you don't already have a frame to use, and if you are working relatively small, then instead of buying a frame specific to this purpose, have a hunt around in your attic or at a charity shop and look for a picture frame that is reasonably wide and will take a pin or a staple. When I use a new frame, whether it be a professional one or a thrift store find, the first thing that I do before I use it is to cover one side of the frame, the one I will be working on, with gather tape or fabric tape. This is a great trick that I picked up a while back because I was finding that the edges of my work were being contaminated with rogue colours. And this is because the frame was made of wood and the wood was absorbing dyes that they had come in contact with. And then when the frame was used the next time, the dyes were being transferred back onto the cloth and they were spreading. So by covering the working side of my frame with a non-absorbent surface, it is easier at the end of the project just to give it a quick wipe down and know that there will be no accidental colour transfer the next time I use it. Before I begin painting a batik, I create a line drawing and a colour plan of my work. Then I transfer my line drawing onto a piece of cotton. This one is a lightweight cotton. I often get asked what grade of pencil do I use for this, and as always the answer is it depends. I tend to use mainly a 2B or 3B pencil with a very sharp point, and I press reasonably lightly when making my pencil marks. However, sometimes I do use a slightly softer pencil and press a little harder, as these lines will be more permanent and will still be slightly visible during the latter stages of the painting process. So if I have a particularly complex area, which is made up of dark colours, I will make the marks more visible. And conversely, when I'm drawing up a particularly light area, I will press less hard and make the marks fainter. You will find the right pencil grade that suits you best, but bear in mind that the harder you press on the cloth, the more likely it is that your cloth will move or bunch up, making the line wobbly or jagged. Once I finish drawing up my sketch or design, it's time to put the fabric onto my frame. When stretching my frame, I begin with the corners and pin the cloth to each corner, creating enough tension in the fabric to raise it to a level position. I take some time positioning and then repositioning my cloth to ensure that the weave is straight and the tension is not too tight, which can distort the fabric. I most often use pins as the fabric will loosen up a little when wet, and with big pieces I often readjust my pins to cater for this as I progress through my batik. However, when doing a small piece, these pins get in the way, so I'm going to position my cloth with pins and then replace them with staples when I'm happy with the positioning. Once that's done, I outline all my jigsaw shapes onto the cloth with wax. And when doing this, I pay special attention to the quality of my lines, and what I want is for each jigsaw shape to be fully outlined in wax with no gaps and weak areas where the wax has not gone fully through the material. You can check your work by flipping the frame over and looking at the back. If my lines need work, then double waxing will do the job. And I spend a little time making sure each shape is a solid line with no gaps anywhere. These are wax barriers, and if you wax a shape that encloses an area fully, you can prevent your dyes from bleeding outside of that area. Let me show you what I mean. I've mixed up my 3 primaries in 3 separate tubs, trying to keep the strength of each roughly the same. Then I simply paint on the lemon yellow within the wax lines of one of my shapes, and if I did it right, the colour will fill the shape and not spread out beyond my wax. You see, the wax acts as a dam and stops the dye from spreading beyond the line. And if you enclose a piece of cloth in a simple wax line, then you can happily add colour within this area and know that it will not spread. I will show you what happens if you don't make your wax line solid in a moment. And when painting up to a wax line, I add the dye a tiny distance from the line and push it into the corners and edges as the dye spreads out. That way I know that I'm less likely to go over the line and paint the dye accidentally on the other side. Then I mixed up a golden yellow. When mixing a colour with magenta, make sure that you test your work on the edge of your cloth or a separate piece of fabric, as I know that my yellow is quite strong and I only added a little bit of the magenta, and yet it appears far more orange than what I expected. Now, magenta works in strange ways, and I've noticed that when creating a colour containing this dye, the finished colour and the one that I've painted on rarely look the same, and it takes a little while to get to know this particular colour well enough to limit the surprises. To be honest, I'm always very cautious when using magenta and make sure that I'm really happy with the results when dry on a separate piece of cloth before committing the dye to my painting. And when it comes to this golden yellow, the colour on my palette appears to have far more magenta in it than it does when I paint it onto the cloth. Watch how the dye behaves on dry cloth. Magenta is by far the strongest of the 3 primaries, and it will stain your fabric instantly, even without the chemical water as the reacting agent. The yellow and turquoise seem to give you a fair amount of time to continue dyeing before they start to noticeably alter the colour of the fibres. However, the magenta just clamps straight onto those fibres, so any colour with magenta in it may need to be painted perhaps with a larger brush, but it definitely needs to be painted with care. As you can see, this variation faded once the cloth was dry and in fact added interest to what otherwise would have been a flat colour. So this is a good way of adding very subtle texture to an otherwise flat area. Batik painting is a very organic thing, and when I create a batik painting, I see it a little as taming the abstract. The organic nature of this way of creating means that no matter how careful or skilled you are, accidents will always happen, and they'll happen throughout the development of your painting. In the early days, I'd throw away so many batiks that didn't work out, or I made a mistake early on that spoiled the whole thing. These days, I look for these accidents, add them to my list of techniques to use, and find a workaround for the mistake so that the painting can be saved. All this problem solving and unexpected surprises are what makes batik painting so enjoyable to me. I will share my workarounds with you in later videos and hopefully help those who enjoy batik painting as much as I do to embrace the mistakes and enjoy what you've learned from them. Anyway, back to my dyes. After creating my golden yellow, I added a little more magenta to my golden yellow on the palette and created an orange, checking the colour carefully before applying it. And then, by adding just a little more magenta, I created a red. Next up is the magenta, and as I'm about to create a new family of colours, I will wash my brushes and change my water pot just to make sure that the colours are really clean. After painting in the magenta shape, I add a little turquoise to my palette and created a purple. Now this purple was a bit blue dominant for what I was trying to achieve, but at the end I will show you the effect of adding a second dye can have on a colour, and I'll show you how I rectify this coldness by adding just a little more warmth to my purple. After that, I add a little more turquoise to my purple and I've created a blue. Then, after changing my colour and cleaning my brushes again, I lay down the turquoise in the next jigsaw piece. So then finally, all I did was mix equal amounts of the lemon yellow and the turquoise together, and this creates the most punchy green possible. If I show you how all those colours look wet and dry, you can see that all the colours have become a little paler, and others have actually changed colour slightly. If you want to improve your use of dyes, noting down these sorts of details and remembering them when batik painting will greatly improve your dyeing skills. And remember, every mistake may be a technique that you can use in your work, so play around with the dyes and keep records of the results. Now I'm going to play around with the remaining jigsaw pieces and show you what happens in various scenarios. First, you can see here where my wax barrier was not good enough and the dye has spread outside of the shape. Now I will be dyeing that area black at the end, so this isn't an issue. Next, let me show you how differently the dyes behave painted onto wet cloth as opposed to dry. So I simply wet the area with a little chemical water and began adding magenta to the shape. See how the dyes spread out far more easily, creating a gradually lighter and lighter colour. And this magenta is so quick to bond with the fibres that even wet on wet doesn't seem to help to create an even colour. Although, admittedly, I have exaggerated this here just to show you what is going on better. Now, dyeing onto wet cloth is great for blends and variations in the intensity of dyes, but when used to create small solid shapes, it is actually quite hard to do, as the dyes will always spread out and can make you think that the colour is solid, when in fact it really isn't. And when dry, I often find the results a little disappointing, with the colour less vibrant, as expected. And as you can see here, when dry, it appears a lot paler than it does wet. So I tend to use wet on wet only for large areas such as a sky, and you can see the difference in intensity with that created using the wet on dry method. If you look here at the piece where I showed you what can happen if you add the dyes wet on wet, you can see that the dyes actually spread to the next jigsaw piece. Let me show you what happens when I then dye that jigsaw piece with green. If you look carefully, you can see that what has happened. The area that was contaminated with the magenta has now turned a horrible colour. This is what you need to avoid if you want your colours to remain clean and not muddy. Although I'll go into this in far more detail in a future video, it is worth observing how colours mix on cloth. Here I use the magenta as a base, then I added turquoise over the top in the bottom half and let that blend naturally. And then I added a little lemon yellow to the top and again observed how the colours blended. I did a number of different sample dyes to complete the jigsaw, and I'll be referring to these in future videos when explaining other dyeing techniques. But if you're trying this at home, just concentrate on mixing your dyes and observing the results. Just before I finish, let me show you what I did to improve the purple. So I waited to see what the final purple looked like once the cloth was dry, and as expected it was slightly lighter than when wet, but I had also hoped that the colour would dry a little warmer, and it hasn't. In fact, it appears a little colder, if I'm honest. So I'm going to try to warm it up a little. I took a very diluted magenta, tested it out on the edge of the cloth for strength until I was happy, and then simply laid this dye over the top of my original colour. And once that dye was dry, you can see that the colour has changed just slightly and is now just a tad warmer. And of course, if I still wasn't happy, I could repeat this process until I achieved the colour I wanted. But be warned, if you add too much magenta, there is no going back, as once a dye has been painted onto a piece of fabric, the only way to change it is by making it either darker or a more intense colour. Wow, well, I feel like I've covered a lot in this video. If you're unclear on any of the techniques mentioned, don't worry, I'll be revisiting these in the future. However, for now, I think I'll bring this video to an end, and in the next video, I will show you how to create your own contemporary batik painting on fabric and have some fun with colour. So until the next time, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to learn more, and I'll see you next time. But until then, just remember that whatever you do today, just make it creative.